Good afternoon and welcome to the Rumi Forum. We are pleased to have with us today Stuart Schwartzstein, and he will speak to us today on piracy and terrorism in Somalia. Mr. Schwartzstein has worked as a foreign affairs professional for more than 30 years, having served in the Defense and State Departments in a wide range of capacities, including as a diplomat, an analyst, negotiator, advisor, and planner. He has also held positions in several think tanks, including CSIS, Center for Strategic and International Studies in Washington, D.C. His work has ranged broadly, both geographically and in subject matter, including defense industrial cooperation with European allies, technology transfer and export control issues, information revolution issues, encryption policy, international science and technology policy, chemical and biological weapons issues, refugee policy, Horn of Africa issues, relations with European allies, and ASEAN countries and the Middle East. While at the Center for Strategic and International Studies, he did a good deal of work on Iraq issues. This was during 1992 to 1996, particularly focusing on human rights violations by Saddam Hussein and his regime. In 2004, he served in the Coalition Provisional Authority in Baghdad as an advisor to the Minister for Science and Technology and to the President of the Iraqi National Academy of Sciences. He has continued to follow events in Iraq and has maintained contact with a number of Iraqi friends, including several in senior Iraqi government positions, as well as officials and experts in the U.S. Mr. Schwartzstein is currently an independent consultant based in Washington, D.C. Please welcome Mr. Schwartzstein. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, you put me at a disadvantage because everyone will want to take a look, will want to look at you, not me.
Oh no! Oh my dear, I hope not.
Anyway, let me start out with a question that I'll answer. What do we think about when we think of Somalia? And what's in the news? Well, that it's a failed state, as the expression goes. We think of humanitarian disasters. We think of piracy. We think of Islamic fundamentalism. We think of terrorism. What don't we see mentioned very much, or don't hear discussed? Population and demography. And my premise is that the most serious problem of Somalia and the most important cause of the breakdown in governance and civil order, resulting in civil conflict, humanitarian disaster, and Somalia becoming overall a failed state, is overpopulation. That population has far outpaced the capacity of the country to sustain itself. I think the attraction of some Somalis now to radical fundamentalist Islam is also a symptom of the breakdown and of the competition for scarce resources caused clearly by overpopulation. Piracy I see as, and I think should be seen as, simply a means of making some money in a country with few resources and fewer opportunities. And I think we need to consider, what I'm saying is we need to consider the fundamental problem rather than the symptoms. Let me start with some population, a little bit about population and get a sense. Current population figures for Somalis and Somalia are difficult to obtain. Now, first of all, no census has been taken since 1975. And even then, it probably was not accurate for political reasons, various kinds of manipulating that was done by the Siad Barre regime. But also the majority of Somalis are nomadic. And they spread across not just the country that has been known as Somalia, but the Ogaden, which is part of Ethiopia, and part of Kenya, Northwest territories in Kenya. And of course, according to weather conditions, climate, availability of water, there will be migrations. In any case, the population of Somalia, or perhaps we'd say Somalis, in Somali inhabited territories, was fairly static for hundreds, if not thousands of years. In 1900, just shortly after colonization by the British and the Italians, the population was less than 1.3 million. From then to the end of the Second World War, it grew significantly, and in the decades since independence, even more so. There are several estimates of the current population, and the current population, according to number of people, and I think it's pretty close to the mark, is somewhere around 9.5 million. But let me go back to some figures. In 1930, it was about 2.2 million. In 1919, sorry, let me go further. In 1935, 2.5 million. 1935, remember the year that Mussolini invaded Ethiopia, with the support, I might add, of Somali troops who were quite eager to do that. In 1945, it had gone up to 4 million, 4.1 million. By the time, shortly after independence, in 1961, it was about, let's see, 61. I'm getting some of these, it's printed out in an odd way. In any case, by 1991, it was estimated it was around 8 million. It may be more than 9.5 million now, but there are also population projections for the future, and one projection is that in the year 2015, it would be 16 million. Now, some years ago, in 1993, in the period of when the U.S. was very much involved militarily in Somalia, and I was in the Office of the Secretary of Defense looking at long-term planning for Somalia, I went back to some estimates by agronomists as to the carrying capacity of the country. Now remember, it is primarily a country that relies on raising livestock. There are two river valleys with arable land, which arable land constitutes about 2% of the land of the country. And there are no significant industries, there are no significant natural resources. But the estimate by agronomists of the carrying capacity of the country, the most optimistic of which was that between 5 and 6 million people could be sustained. So very clearly, by 1992, it had been a significant difference between the two. Let me go to a bit more on population here. That a few other. It's not just numbers, but age distribution in a population is highly relevant. As a bit of an aside, I don't know if anyone here has read that wonderful Barbara Tuchman book, A Distant Mirror, which she chronicles 14th century Europe. And one of her observations in that book was that if we see many of the medieval figures as childish, we shouldn't be entirely surprised, because by and large the populations were very young. And various characters like Godefroy de Bouillon, a crusader, and a number of others, a century later, Gilles de Rais, were young. Godefroy de Bouillon, I think, when he went off to the Crusades, was 19. Gilles de Rais was a Marshal of France at the age of 26. So age and age distribution is a factor. And it's not just a question of dependency ratios, of those who are too young or too old to be productive, but what we've seen is that in many societies in which there is a large proportion of the population aged 20 and younger, that we see considerable civil conflict. Cambodia is one of those countries. The Gaza Strip, which had for a very long time an amazing rate of population increase of I think about 5%, the world's highest, has certainly not been an area in which has been lacking in conflict. What I'd add too is that when you've got a country in which resources are relatively scarce, when you have a large cohort of young men between, say, the ages of 15 and 30, who have no work, no employment, and basically the answer came back that if there is any, it's not in quantities profitable enough to extract. There's been talk over the years of oil in Somalia, and there was a study done in the late 1980s by some petroleum geologists. That study showed that there is a probability of oil in Somalia, but, and the but is an important one, what petroleum geologists evidently call plays, the pools of oil, are relatively discrete and small, unlike those under Iraq and Saudi Arabia and Iran. So that means that both exploration and extraction are considerably more expensive than they would be elsewhere. And of course, heavy investment is not going to be made in a country with that kind of conflict. In addition to which, of course, it's not just the exploration and extraction, it's the transportation. The same reason that, for example, Conoco gave up its concessions in the Sudan some years ago. It was just too much of an investment in an area in which there was conflict. I might add, too, that some of the phenomena that we're seeing of overpopulation in Somalia, I think we've also seen in Darfur. It's not been, as I've looked at it, it's not been simply a matter of one group against another or genocide. Violence, yes, but there's been significant deforestation there and environmental degradation, as in Somalia. Now, there are those, and some here maybe remember what I refer to sometimes as the more is merrier school. The late Julian Simon was one of those who said, well, it's not a matter of population numbers because take a look at Taiwan and Hong Kong and Singapore, very high population densities, and look how prosperous they are. To which I would say, yes, it's possible, but take a look at those societies that most of the East Asian societies have thousands of years of civilization behind them, a strong work ethic, and a certain veneration for education. The same does not exist in Somalia and a number of other such societies, just as the Somali language, for example, was not written until 1972. It's also not one of those languages in which scientific research can be conducted. It hasn't got the ability, as many languages around the world, probably the majority, don't. But to transform a country like Somalia into something like an Asian tiger, one might say isn't impossible. It might take a matter of education. I would say yes, not impossible, but we couldn't expect that it would be done in less than a century. And of course, part of a culture, I mean, cultures change, of course, but if the culture doesn't have the kinds of values that can adapt to the kind of economic activity that will benefit the country, then it's at a serious disadvantage. In Somalia, with the longest coastline in Africa, many would have thought that fishing would be a major industry. But for some reason in Somali culture, fishing and fish are despised. And there's an old Somali saying, "Let no man speak to me with fish on his breath." Back in the 1970s, early 70s, an attempt was made to resettle a lot of Somali nomads in coastal villages and turn them into fishermen. And that worked for a short period of time until the rains came, in which at which time many of those resettled just went back to the bush. So it's a question of, again, of culture to a degree. Now, the Somali, just a little bit of history, the Somali Republic came into existence in 1960 as the merger of British Somaliland in the north and Italian Somalia in the south, or what had been Italian Somalia, because after the Second World War it was transformed from a colony to a trusteeship territory. It became the Somali Republic, and then the Somali Democratic Republic after it became a dictatorship. I think it is doubtful now, even population questions aside, that given the fragmentation of Somali society, that any central government in Mogadishu would be accorded the legitimacy necessary for a central government. It's a society that's far too fractured, and of course with the competition for scarce resources, there is inevitably considerable conflict. How the Somalis see themselves is also relevant. It's relevant to, particularly to the question of terrorism and support for terrorism. First, the question of Somali attitudes towards Arabs. It's ambivalent. On the one hand, they see Arabs as foreigners, sometimes as rich, condescending foreigners, and there's not a little envy. A number of Somalis have gone to work in Saudi Arabia. Many will make the Hajj. But at the same time, they see Arabs as fellow Muslims, and there's a certain affinity there. Somalia became in 1974 a member of the Arab League. And wasn't 74, maybe it was earlier. I think it was. But in any case, it was Somalia that in 1973 introduced in the UN the Zionism equals racism motion. Not that the Somalis really give a damn about Israel-Palestinian conflict, but in that case it was a matter of wanting to be, I would say, more royal than the king. In the same way that over the years, before the end of apartheid, Somalia made any number of usual statements, but had no problems trading with South Africa. So now the Somali attitude towards Africans is also an interesting one, because by and large Somalis see the Africans to the south as inferior. The only other Africans they see as equals are those in the Horn of Africa, Ethiopians, Eritreans, and of course those are enemies. But and this is relevant to, I think, both piracy and terrorism. There is a high degree of xenophobia amongst Somalis. There is also something of a sense that foreigners are, you might say, fair game. And in Somali oral literature, there are tales of someone called Wilwal, if I remember the name correctly, who was essentially a bandit who went up and down the East African coast. The term shifta, which is used in East Africa, means bandit, but it also means rebel. And those who may have followed certain events in Kenya may remember how there have been what have been referred to as shifta wars and constant conflict against, conflict with shiftas and banditry, primarily that of Somalis. I see the pirates, Somali pirates, as essentially seagoing shiftas. And my sense is that for most Somalis, it's seen as fair game. But also, quite simply, in a country with so few resources, to be able to, with a certain amount of risk inevitably, win big that way is certainly attractive. Without a central government that is able to deal with that, it will continue to exist unless other powers, maritime powers, are able to patrol it truly effectively. Now, to that I might add there's an exception. Now, Somalia has fragmented. There's what is called the Somaliland Republic in the north, which is essentially in what had been British territory. It has not been recognized by the United States or the UK, and that's primarily because, at least in the case of the US position, the official US position has been that the US would not recognize the Somaliland Republic until such time that the African Union did. The African Union, following the old OAU principle that of respect for colonial boundaries, somehow hasn't recognized that actually recognizing the Somaliland Republic would indeed respect the colonial boundaries. But there's been no movement on that. I think after the referendum in Sudan, if the southern Sudan ends up becoming independent, that will change things significantly. And after all, the southern part of Sudan was never independent. But that's relevant to piracy because the ports and parts of the coastline that from which pirates have gone have not been from Somaliland Republic, which has been able to establish itself relatively well and as a fairly democratic government. Let me, because I've already, I think, gone over time, talk a little bit about terrorism as I see it. I think first of all, the terrorism that we are, I think, most concerned with at this time is that which is linked to Islamic fundamentalism, and particularly Al-Qaeda. And so I think we ought to consider Islamic fundamentalism in Somalia. Now, I find it somewhat surprising that there is an attraction to Islamic fundamentalism in Somalia because there's no tradition of that in that country. Unlike Egypt, which had the Muslim Brotherhood going back to the 1920s, unlike the Wahhabi movement in the Hadramaut going back to the 18th century, if I remember correctly, there hasn't been that. And for at least the last century, or more than the last century, Sharia has been restricted to matters of, essentially to family matters, to marriage and divorce and inheritance. And Somali law has been a mix of British, Italian, and indigenous Somali law. And then, of course, that which was added on from the time of independence. At the same time, I mean, while Somali women tend to dress fairly modestly, there's been no tradition of wearing a chador or niqab or being heavily veiled. And not that the status of women in Somalia is anything to be envied, but nonetheless, it's never been the way in certain other Muslim countries has been traditional. While I think very few Somalis would ever eat pork, there wasn't much temptation because the only porcine animal in Somalia is the warthog, which I might add isn't all that tasty. But as for alcohol, remember, most Somalis are nomads and didn't go around with stills. When I lived in Mogadishu, I remember, though, I mean, that was a city, many Somalis did drink beer, saying it was a bit like, gave the same feeling of fullness as camel's milk. But my point really is that there hasn't been a tradition of Somalis being radical fundamentalists in any way. And there haven't been religious figures who have been venerated in Somalia. The national figure, Muhammad Abdullah Hassan, referred to by the Brits as the Mad Mullah, wasn't so much a religious figure as he was first a clan leader, and then after his death became a nationalist figure. My sense is that the attraction to various kinds of fundamentalism is a result of the breakdowns in civil society, is the result of an attraction to what is probably seen as an orderly society, or the possibility of an orderly society, which is what the Islamic courts was able to provide for a short period of time, effectively across the country. Now, that's linked to terrorism, but I don't believe that there is either the depth of, you might say, resentment that has propelled both Al-Qaeda and others who were similarly attracted on the part of Somalis. And some of that has to do, I think, with what I'd call Somali Xenophobia. And also a sense of Somali's role in the world. There is a certain, as I've seen it, you might say ethnocentrism, which curiously enough, in 1993, when U.S. troops were there, a number of Somalis were saying, that proves how important we are. Otherwise, would the U.S. be here? So my own sense is that that while Somalia, given the lack of any effective government, may from time to time harbor certain figures, that it's not in itself, the country in itself is not one with which we need to be seriously concerned about a number of emerging terrorists. So I think with that, though, I'll go back to my premise that the fundamental problem is one of overpopulation. And I think I've already gone over time.
No, so. That's okay. Thank you. I'm going to take the privilege of the moderator and ask 2 questions before we turn it over to the audience. So you say it's not inherent, this fundamentalism, religious fundamentalism necessarily to Somali culture.
I don't believe it is.
Yeah. So I'm wondering, where is this coming from? And and also, how is the country able to sustain itself currently? Where is, to put it frankly, the money coming from? And how does Saudi Arabia tie into this? I'm from Minnesota. We have the largest Somali refugee population in Minneapolis. The women walking in chadors down the street in Minneapolis, which is extremely white state, and Norwegian, obviously. And it was a big change, a big shock for many Minnesotans, obviously. And so,
not to mention for the Somalis.
Correct, because I know many that don't. And so not that, of course,
well, the question of where's the money coming from is important.
Where is this fundamentalism coming from?
First of all, there is an informal economy that does function to a certain degree, though the last figures I looked at, I mean, the annual per capita income is fairly low, somewhere around $500 a year. A lot of it is remittances. There are many Somalis who are working abroad or living abroad, as those who went to Minnesota, and they send money back. Okay. In addition to which, considerable, I think even now, a certain amount of foreign assistance. For the years, from the years of independence till the breakdown, it's my understanding that on a per capita basis, Somalia had the highest level of foreign assistance of all of Africa. And certainly there was a lot of money that was given to the country. Some of it skimmed off. I think Siad Barre, when he died, had a fortune, much of which seems to have disappeared, but it was estimated at something like $150 million, which by kleptomaniac standards isn't great, but still for a country like Somalia is respectable. I would say pretty much it's a combination of what they are able to do in Somalia and remittances and foreign assistance that's kept them afloat. And at the same time, it's not exactly a high standard of living for most of the population. So,
and Saudi Arabia doesn't play a part in any of this?
Saudi Arabia has given money at times. I don't know what the Saudis are doing right now.
Okay.
They've not played a major role in politically in the country, and I don't know whether they funded Quranic schools in Somalia in recent years. They did back in the 70s, but I don't know whether in recent years they.
So where do you think the fundamentalism is coming from? What is the influence if it's not indigenous?
Well, no, it's not indigenous, but remember, there's quite a few Somalis have been working in Saudi Arabia over the years, and it's not a country that's hermetically sealed. I mean, the communication nowadays makes it possible, and a lot of cell telephones in Somalia and radios. Radios have always have been big there. And there is a keen awareness of what's going on elsewhere. So I think it's not surprising that there'd be a certain influence, even if it does, as I see it, to some degree goes against what you might say the prevailing culture.
Right. Okay, thank you. All right. Yes, Abraham. The microphone? Yes, Abraham. Oh, I'm sorry, sir. Can he go first, and then you certainly?
Yeah.
Can you stand up?
Stand up.
Your name?
Abraham Abidor, formerly with the Foreign Egg Service. I enjoyed very much your presentation. I have two historical questions. The Italian troops under Graziani first conquered the region, both Ethiopia, Eritrea, and part of Somalia. In 38.
When you say first. In 35,
and then British troops under General Wingate, in collaboration with Haile Selassie, liberated the region. So obviously, the two countries, there are many Italians still living there in Addis, in Asmara, in parts of Somalia.
I don't think there are virtually no Italians left in Somalia or any part of it.
But in the other countries, in
Asmara, I don't think they're left anymore, from what I've heard. And
all the taxi drivers that give me rides tell me that there are many Italians there. But anyway, they said that Asmara looks like a second Rome. But anyway, the question here with this colonial heritage, what do the EU, Italy and the UK, do they have any interest in affecting the outcome of what's happening in the region?
Well, have had, yes, absolutely.
Yeah. And also, why Somalia has developed differently from the other countries in the region, Eritrea and Ethiopia, with similar historical colonial development. Why did they develop to be more violent than Eritrea and Ethiopia?
Well, first of all, the colonial era for Ethiopia was fairly short. Because it was the only African country not to be colonized up until 1935 when Marshal Badoglio marched in. But again, I would go back to, yes, there are differences partly because of culture, partly because of religion. Remember, many Ethiopians are Christian, and different experiences. The land is also different. There is considerably more arable land in Ethiopia than in Somalia. So I think it's not surprising that they've developed somewhat differently for any number of reasons, though there are a number of similarities.
How about Eritrea?
Well, I have to admit, first, I don't know enough about Eritrea and Eritrean culture, though, as it had been part of Ethiopia for up until independence relatively recently, about 20 years ago, I think now. Yes, of course, as an Italian colony, shared certain things with Somalia, but the Eritreans speak a different language. Half of the Eritreans are Christian. And so it's, I think, a significantly different society.
And the colonial, the interest of the EU in...
Well, yeah, over the years the EU has had an interest, not necessarily more than in many other African countries, but then there's a question of, the extent to which foreign assistance from the EU or anywhere else can be truly effective. And the EU has not been different from many other donor countries or coalitions.
Yes, sir. Yes.
Thank you. Thank you for those comments. I'm interested in a couple of things. Mike Kurtzig, formerly from the U.S. Department of Agriculture, now an educator. The question on demographics, if I heard you correctly, you said the population now is 9 million? And in 6 years,
9.9,
in 5 years it'll be 15 million?
Sorry?
You said in 5 years it'll be 15 million, is that the estimate?
That's an estimate, yeah.
That's a natural increase in the population? They must have the highest population
I haven't
rate.
gone over these figures. I was supposed to sit down with somebody at the World Bank before,
Okay.
but the snow last week made that impossible.
Okay.
I'm a little bit skeptical about that.
Sounds a little bit.
But because that's a significant increase over what it is. But then I was actually also amending what on this particular set of projections was the population currently. I mean, this particular set of projections has the current population at 14 million. The estimates are so wide-ranging, but obviously some people do believe that it could be as much as 16 million in 2015.
Okay, so I have a second question. Concerns the hijacking of those oil tankers. And the question is, where is that money going? Can we trace the money? Is it supporting terrorism? Is it supporting Somalia itself, the economy? And what are we doing about it? I mean, I know we think you can just shoot them out.
My understanding is that the piracy is itself not connected to fundamentalist groups. Speaking of piracy, though, I mean, there was a comment made to me some years ago by Johan Lewis, who's really the dean of Somali scholars. And it's a funny line. He said that Somalis are hopeless at routine, but brilliant at improvisation. And I think one way of looking at piracy is a certain amount of improvisation. Now, where's the money gone? Well, my understanding is that some of the pirates who made off with money have built themselves expensive houses in coastal areas in Somalia. Undoubtedly, a lot of the money has been shared, because in Somali culture, you don't just hoard the money yourself. It's going to be shared with your family and clan family. Now, I think the difficulty in dealing with piracy is the question of, do you go on land, basically? The experience in '93 was one that you might say scarred this country, and from '93 on, I mean, for a number of years after '93, it was hard to get anyone in the U.S. government to even want to talk about Somalia. But I think that there is that fear of being, of sending, and what do you do? Send in troops to Somalia again? How do you deal with it? Now, and I was going to talk about it, or I had already gone over long, but in '93, I came up with some proposals that went nowhere, but I still think have a certain some merit, and that was that there be created what I call functional trusteeships. Now, the idea of trusteeships, as Somalia had been from 45 to 60 under Italy, a geographic trusteeship, under the UN, the Trusteeship Council still exists, but functional, that is, assigned by the UN, by the Security Council, certain functions to be carried out not even necessarily physically in Somalia, by which I mean things like telecommunications and postal, central banking. And one of the others that I had in mind was maritime issues and ports. Now, one of the things that resented by Somalis quite rightly over a period of years has been that the 200-mile economic zone along Africa's longest coast has been fished by any number of foreign fishermen, particularly Taiwanese, paying absolutely nothing. As I see it, a functional trusteeship would demand payment, collect the funds, use those funds for a certain amount of patrolling, and possibly establishing something of a presence in some of the ports. I find it difficult to understand why some of the coastal areas from which the pirates have been going haven't been more closely monitored. But I know that there are various efforts underway at this time. And my expectation is that the seagoing shifters, as I see them, will in not too long encounter such difficulties that it won't exist that much longer. But it's an estimate.
Okay, one more question. Yes, sir.
My name is David Shin from George Washington University. I wanted just to go back to your basic premise and really make a comment on it. As I understand it, your basic argument is that the high population growth rate is at the root of the problem in Somalia. And while I think it's useful to point out the problems that a relatively high population growth rate can cause, I think in the case of Somalia, there are other more basic issues that are really at the root of the problem. This may, in fact, be one of them. But even taking the statistics that you're using, I would question them. I think the 9.5 current population figure for Somalia is at the very high end of the estimates. That's certainly higher than most of those that I see. It almost certainly includes Somaliland in the figure. The figure of 16 million for 2015, I would agree with you, gentlemen, I think is unrealistically high. I just don't know where that figure would come from. And even if you take your high estimate of 9.5 million and compare it with earlier relatively well-documented figures, it's pretty much in line with the average population growth rate of developing countries. Now you can argue that the Somali situation is more fragile than other developing countries. That's perhaps true. But as I say, I'm not even sure that the 9.5 million figure is accurate, particularly when you look at the size of the Somali diaspora today and the exodus of so many Somalis from the country. I really severely doubt that there have been that many coming in.
I think you're absolutely right that all the figures need to be doubted. But I don't really doubt that much, the 9.5 million. And the reason for that is back in '93, there were some of the estimates were that the population was as high as 9.5 million. But they are all over the place.
Well, and they're just estimates. I mean, as you say, there's been
but when
no
I talked
count.
this morning to somebody at the World Bank, and I bounced that figure off her, the 9.5 million, she seemed to think that was fairly accurate.
Well, I guess I would just try to shed some skepticism.
Yeah, no, I think that there's reason for a lot of skepticism, and I think any time a figure is cited, we all ought to go back and say, wait a minute, how do you know? And I have to say, I don't have faith in those. And it's one of the things I do want to go back to trying to get a better sense. Now, in '93, one of the problems was that I remember trying to get the Census Bureau's international division to do a study. And we were spending billions there in Somalia, and OSD didn't have the $60,000 to fork over to the Census Bureau so they could do more work. You know, one of the idiocies of the U.S. government.
I would just conclude by, I didn't quite finish where my argument
sorry.
was going, in that the other, I think, critical issues or basic reasons for the conflict in Somalia is the whole leadership question. It's just been some abysmal leadership in the country, starting with the Siad Barre regime and continuing ever since. And also the whole concept of clan structure and how that has played out under this terrible leadership, I think would, in my view, be more root causes of the conflict than the population issue, although I don't doubt that that has played a role in it.
Well, I think I disagree with you on that. No, I don't underplay or discount at all the clan structure or the leadership problems. I think, but what I think has happened is that the older conflicts have been intensified by the difference between population and available resources. Yes, you know, those divisions within Somali society, sometimes bitter divisions, have existed for a very long time and are dysfunctional to a significant degree. And of course, Siad Barre didn't help with his favoritism to his clan group, the Marahan, and others thought it was their turn. But at the same time, I think that overcoming some of those difficulties is made virtually impossible by the population question. Though, you know, again, you know, I think it's often how you look at it. But I think by and large, the whole issue of population is one that isn't given enough weight. And I don't mean just for Somalia. I think for any number of other countries.
Okay. I think we will conclude with that. So thank you so much for joining us today, and thank you for a wonderful talk. Thank you all for coming to the Rumi Forum for our luncheon, and we have a